Well, there's been surprise at the apparent struggle Russian forces have faced since launching their attacks on Ukraine. Despite having superior firepower and troop numbers, Moscow has not so far had the success anticipated. But despite their difference in size, both militaries are suffering losses.
From air, land and sea, Russia had been proudly showing off its military might for months. And it was no secret that it was far superior to Ukraine's. Before the war started, Ukraine's armed forces were at around 500,000, but Russia's were almost 3 times that at more than 1.3 million. While Ukraine had around 2,500 tanks, Russia had nearly 12,500, almost 5 times its neighbours. Ukraine's total aircraft strength, including warplanes and attack helicopters, stood at 318. Russia's was more than 4,000. But a month after the war began, these figures have probably changed dramatically, with losses on both sides. The Russian Navy has continued to play a crucial role in the Kremlin's war efforts. Caliber cruise missiles are integral to the Navy's ground strike capabilities. It's believed one was used to hit this government building in the city of Kharkiv at the beginning of March. Russian Iskander short-range ballistic missiles have also been used in Kharkiv and other Ukrainian cities. And Moscow has been accused of using cluster bombs on residential areas, which would constitute a war crime. The Kremlin has also claimed it's fired hypersonic missiles like these at targets in Ukraine, although this has not been independently verified. No one knows how much further Russia will go in its assault on Ukraine, nor how long Ukraine can withstand attacks like these.
Well, for more perspective, let's bring in former British military officer Frank Ledwidge. He teaches strategy at the University of Portsmouth. In your opinion, who's winning this war right now?
Russia aren't achieving their objectives by any means. In fact, they've not taken any of their major targets just yet. Ukrainians are holding them. If you want an answer, I would suggest, Ben, that the answer is probably the Ukrainians are winning at this point. The Russians have now culminated, is the military term. It means that the first phase, they've gone as far as they can. They've been stopped by the Ukrainians and they don't have sufficient supplies and equipment to go any further. But your reporter there mentioned Russia having 2 million soldiers or X number of tanks. It's entirely right. But they've deployed a far smaller number than that, and they won't be able to get access to the rest for quite some time.
Their supply lines and communications are down. Generals have been killed. Where does that leave the Russian military, considering its very top-down approach?
Yeah, that issue of being top-down, dirigiste, is an important one. We, or many of us anyway, those people who hadn't actually worked with the Ukrainian armed forces underestimated them. And one of the advantages they have over the Russians is the conceptual element of war. That's the element that looks at how you fight. And since 2014, when they were defeated by Russia, Ukraine's taken a very different approach. They've been trained by Western forces in something called mission command, Auftragstactik, as German military theory calls it. That means you trust your subordinates. And as you pointed out there, Ben, the Russians don't take that view. It's a top-down command approach, and that means your generals, if things aren't working out, they'll be going to the front and they'll be taking casualties. Of course, there's other reasons for that, mainly perhaps Western-assisted, but certainly excellent Ukrainian intelligence, which is able to target these high-value targets. And the result of all these factors is that essentially Russian forces in most fronts are, if not in disarray, they're very much halted.
But Frank, none of that will make much of a difference if nuclear weapons come into play. How real is this threat that we're hearing from Moscow?
It's a threat. For decades, the issue of nuclear weapons within Russian military doctrine has been treated as simply a step forward, not the kind of extreme step change that we, perhaps in the West, would regard it. That doesn't mean they're imminent. I would categorise what's going on now as a little bit of sabre rattling. Russia quite understands that the deployment of such weapons, even in demonstration, would be a very real step change in the war and would almost certainly trigger NATO involvement and consequent defeat on the ground.
Would you say the same for chemical and biological weapons?
Well, that's where matters shift a little. My own view is that chemical weapons and biological weapons, whilst in themselves simply weapons that kill like any other, should be treated as a red line. We have retreated time and time again over the last decade, not only in Syria, but in Crimea and other places, from the Russians with various red lines that weren't complied with. And this should be treated that way. The risk here is, though, that the deployment of chemical weapons will be used as a false flag by Russians, by the Russian armed forces, in order to excuse other forms of escalation.
Frank, can you give us some hope as far as the people of Ukraine go? What could turn the tide for a Ukrainian victory in this war?
Well, one of the first things we can do is stop telling everyone what we're doing. It's up to the West, it's up to NATO, it's up to individual countries what they do to help Ukraine. All this agonising about whether they should give fighters or this or that piece of equipment should stop. NATO countries should give what it is they want to give and not keep telling everybody about it and debating about it. Second thing, ensure or assure the security of the Baltic states. So that provides a backstop. As for the Ukrainians themselves, what we can do is continue supplying them with the best weapons, release the bureaucratic shackles on handing over some ready-made pieces of equipment. So, for example, some of the pieces of equipment in the British or American arsenals that will require various permissions to hand over. Those shackles should be released. And finally, NATO should start issuing red lines and complying with them.
Former British military officer Frank Ledwidge, thank you very much for coming on the show today. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.